I think it's very obvious who the best candidates in this race are.
The divide in politics is about who shows up.
But I just don't buy the purple state argument.
All is well in Zion.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Polling Alley, the Overton Insights podcast, where we will break down polling data and trends shaping today's political landscape. I'm your host, Olivia Michels, the poll analyst here at Overton Insights, and I'm joined by Mark Cunningham, the Overton Insights poll director, and Michael Melendez, the founder of Tactical Campaigns. We have some exciting stuff on the agenda today, so let's start by talking about the Texas Senate primaries. They're coming up in a little less than a month, and we have some really interesting races going on both sides. So, Mark, can you set us up? What's going on? What are we seeing in the polling right now?
Yeah, well, this is the first, and maybe Michael has a different example. I don't think I've ever seen a state like this with two very contested primaries on both sides where it's really still a toss-up a month before. And again, in a state that is generally thought of as a red state, I think people have talked about becoming purple, but it's still clearly pretty red. So, on the Democratic side, you have kind of two pretty popular politicians on the left. James Talarico, who's a state legislature, and then Jasmine Crockett, who's a U.S. representative, who's gotten a lot of national press recently. And then on the right, you have kind of an interesting, combination. We have John Cornyn, who's been there seemingly forever. You have Ken Paxton, who was, charged with crimes, and they turned out maybe not to be true, and people are going there. And then you have Wesley Hunt, who's kind of this upstart, kind of, very far right, trying to take the farthest right section of the electorate. So it's a really interesting race. And there's a lot of storylines behind this, where the polling is actually really, really not matching kind of what you're seeing in the betting markets. And this is one where me and Michael have talked about, a lot of times we talk about herding, right? Where these polls all look similar to the same, that they will wait it because they said they don't want to go out on a limb. But I will tell you what, Emerson has gone out on a limb when it comes to the Democratic primary, where they show James Talarico up double digits. The other four polls all show Jasmine Crockett winning. So this is going to be one where, and Emerson is clearly, in my opinion, the most legitimate pollster who's done the race. So that's one. And the right is kind of interesting because you kind of have this it's not necessary. You kind of have the pro-Trump section of voting, and they don't like John Cornyn, but they have two choices in Wesley Hunt, and Paxton, who's the favorite. So it's really interesting to see how they will take votes away from each other. And the Democratic primary is getting really, really nasty online. And there's a lot of, there's some racial things going on with the Democratic primary. There's a lot of people saying that Jasmine Crockett can't win a general, but Talarico can. So it's just been really interesting to watch. I have a lot of thoughts about it.
Well, to respond to Mark, I think races like this do happen. I think this might be the first time it's happened in the Trump era, and so it takes on a different hue to it, and the interest that people have with regards to the race, and that's the interesting thing, right? Like, Trump isn't on the ballot, but still that's going to be a big issue with this particular race. The other thing I would say is, just to hammer home what Mark was saying, is in a lot of those polls that show Crockett winning, she's barely winning, right? Like, it's not and I would say the bigger thing to take away from that is people just saying, oh, the race is close. It's they're a 1 or 2 point difference, and that's a easy position to take, to just say, oh, it's divided. We don't really know who's going to win. And we'll see how things shake out over the next 6 weeks or so.
Yeah, you guys both touched on this, but a lot of the polls have that neck and neck, super close on, honestly, both sides to an extent. And then we have Emerson coming out and being that outlier, saying Talarico is almost 10 points ahead. But when we're looking at all these different candidates with lots of different storylines, lots of headlines for really everyone, who do you see as actually electable on both sides? How do you see electability coming into play?
I think that is a tough one in this particular case, because I feel like at the end of the day, the matchups matter. And then something that I don't have experience with is a 3-month runoff. Usually in different campaigns, places where I've been, runoffs take place in 2 weeks or a month. And I think that'll be very interesting to see what happens in these runoffs where the two candidates really go at it and beat each other up and in many ways reduce their electability to the overall general election population. Now, I think, of course, both candidates that are more extreme, I think will have a harder time in a general election. It will bring things more into the middle, and that provides an opportunity for a more middle of the road candidate. I think that's just how it would go.
So what's interesting is I actually disagree with Michael. I think it's very obvious who the best candidates in this race are. I think when you talk about electability on the right, it's clearly Cornyn, which I mean, basically Michael said that's somehow, the more moderate, I guess, based on who's doing that, or at least maybe more normal in people's mind where it's not, I'm going to do everything Trump wants. It's like, I'll do 90% of things Trump wants. So that's, for in the Republican primary, that's somebody who's independent, I guess. But on the left, what's interesting is that the general consensus Talarico is the more electable candidate in the general election. But at the same time, he's actually also probably more liberal than Crockett. If you look now, maybe his, the way he talks about things is not where Crockett's more of, a firecracker, somebody who's fighting for that Talarico actually has voted more to the left of where Crockett is. So that's an interesting thing where somebody's coming off as more moderate in what they say, but the other person, actually is more moderate. So it'll be interesting what that happens. But the same thing that Michael said about the runoff, I think is going to be problematic for the Democrats in this primary. They are starting to really go at each other. And if there is this, again, I've seen a lot on Twitter and I've seen a lot from the, maybe not officially the Crockett campaign, but Crockett spokespeople making it a lot about race. Where if this comes down to Talarico wins the primary, and I think I saw the votes, I think about 65-70% of black voters are going to vote for Crockett in the primary. That could be a real issue if they really go down this hole and they say, oh, Talarico is, his campaign is racist or something like that. And then you have, potentially black voters saying, well, I don't know, I might sit home when it comes to the actual election. I may not vote for him over, John Cornyn. Now, Ken Paxton is a lot more of a firebrand where, you might get Democrats who are not super happy going to vote against him. But my opinion is that it's clearly both sides know what they want, and the betting markets kind of show that, it is right now Talarico and Paxton are the clear favorites in these races, despite what the polls say.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a really interesting point, I think, about race, and then you also have the factor in Texas of there's not just like black voters, there's Latino voters, plus the like urban rural differences in Texas. And I think a lot of that is why people are saying, oh, okay, we might see Texas leaning a little bit more purple moving forward. So there's a lot of interesting dynamics in that sense too. I kind of want to go quickly back to the Republican primary and talk about one of the polls we were looking at where in the head-to-heads we see Hunt doing really well compared to Paxton and Cornyn. And you guys both were saying that Cornyn is this kind of clear moderate. He's been there he's a long time incumbent. Do you see a situation where Hunt is sort of pushing him out? Could we see a runoff where Cornyn, the incumbent, is pushed out? Do you think that's likely? What is, I guess, the strategy there with Hunt being this like third candidate?
I think it's probably unlikely that he'll be able to receive enough votes to just push Cornyn out of a runoff. But it's possible. It's happened. But I think it's just a difficult hill to climb. It would be easier if there was somebody else in the race who was like Cornyn. If there was a fourth person, then that would I would see that as a real possibility.
Yeah.
So I will say there's no way that it's Hunt and Paxton in a row. There's a 0% chance it happens. There's no way because they're taking for the same.
That's a hot take. 0% chance. You guys can take that to the betting market.
That's right. Yeah, I'll say 0.1. I know nothing's a 0% chance, but they're taking from the same voter base. It doesn't make sense. And honestly, this is one where Paxton is probably a 95% favorite if Hunt never got into the race. So he got in and, I think he kind of got in as a spoiler, it seemed like, but he's actually gaining some traction where he can get up to, I've seen 15, 20%. And like you said, people who don't like Cornyn still like Hunt, even if they prefer Paxton. People who don't like Paxton still like Hunt, okay, even if they prefer Cornyn. So like you said, he's doing the best, but I do think that he will not be I think he's a little bit too far right to be a great general election candidate.
Another thing that I've seen in this race is it's being brought on a national stage a lot more than I think certain state races are. But we've seen Talarico with a Super Bowl ad. We've seen a lot of, spokespeople in Jasmine Crockett's campaign. She's obviously a US representative. So we're seeing a lot of things on the Democrat side specifically, but also kind of broadly in this race being brought to the national stage. What do you think about that, Michael?
Well, I mean, that's what's happening to this race is it's becoming the late, because this isn't the first, and nor will be the last race that is being brought to a national level of like, okay, what is it going to say about how people do in this race? And especially with a place like Texas, which is on the border, and those are the types of issues that the Trump administration is caring about. So this is definitely going to flare up those tensions, and it's going to be a part of the entire race, and to see what happens. And I think at the end of the day, people want to see what's going to happen in Texas, which I think Texas is a little deceiving, because if you actually look at the modeling and the registration numbers, it is a lot more Democrat than most people realize. And that's why I look back to, Beto in 2018, where showing that, yeah, this state can be very divided. It's just more that Democrats don't turn out because they don't think that they can win. But the more they think that it's possible, the more they might turn out.
But
Yeah.
so to that point, I have a question because everything you're saying makes sense. But I feel like Texas keeps saying, "Oh, Beto almost won. That's why you could almost be a purple state." It's like, well, look, there's a Republican governor of Vermont. That doesn't make it a purple state. There's a Republican governor of Massachusetts. I feel like they're sticking to this one race that they didn't even win to talk about how they're a purple state. And then meanwhile, pretty much every race since then has been Republican +8, +9, +10. I actually don't really buy the purple state status. We're even getting there. I know what the registration looks like, but look at what the registration looks like in West Virginia, where more Democrats are like. I just think that the Democrats are maybe different in Texas, where they don't vote down the straight Democratic line. I don't know if you have thoughts or numbers on this, but I just don't buy the purple state argument. I think this is what Republicans try to do with Minnesota. It's what, and it just isn't there yet. And they want it to be true. There's so many electoral votes, but I just don't think it's that close.
I guess because I engage at state capitals directly, I guess I would actually argue that most states are purple. That people are not, it's not as clear cut as people like to think. National politics is what makes people think that there's some kind of division. But I would actually argue that most states are purple. And that when it comes down to the issues they're deciding and what they actually do, there's much more working together, consensus, or going back and forth, and the state might lean one way on one issue and then another way on a different issue. I think that there's a lot more gray, and so I would just disagree wholeheartedly, and that's because I think the average person does not view themselves as a Republican or a Democrat in terms of the way their identity.
I think that's fair. I think we have to define what we mean by purple states, right? Because it's really in my opinion, it's like, can somebody from the other party win an election on any given year and it's not a shock? And that's kind of how I define it. So the way you're talking about it also is true. I just think I'm talking about electorally. If you haven't elected if you haven't elected a Republican for statewide office in 30 years, I don't think you're a purple state. And that's kind of where you're at with Texas. So I get what you're saying.
I guess I wasn't commenting on if Texas is a purple state. I was just commenting on the possibility of a Democrat winning statewide. And so I can't speak for what other people say, but do I think Texas is all of a sudden going to become a battleground state for the next 30 years? No, I don't think that. I'm just saying that it is possible that a Democrat could win coming up here soon. Just like started happening in Georgia, or there's other states where all of a sudden it's like, oh wow, we didn't think a Democrat could win here, and now and vice versa, and all of a sudden it's like so it's more in that sense, and what the trends are over the next 20, 30 years are what actually determine whether a state stays purple or not.
And what's interesting is the 2030 census too, is because they're going to be changing, where Democrats have to win more than just the blue wall if the, predictions of what it's going to look like, where you're adding, an electoral college vote in mostly red states. And what you said, Michael, is like Democrats might actually have to go after Texas at some point because they don't have that blue wall. So, like, the question is that a good investment or are there better states?
So you heard it here. Mark is saying if you're a Democrat, move to Texas because that's important for winning national elections in the long run.
And there's a lot of people doing that. A lot of people coming
I-
from California, coming from New York. Yeah, you see a lot of that in Texas these
Yeah,
days.
they need to divide up where they live. They can't all live in California, Illinois, New York. They've got to move. They've got to move to other states.
Well, the Texas cities are growing, that's for sure. So, kind of going back to what Mark was saying about what makes a purple state, would you guys be shocked if we saw Crockett or Talarico win here? You're saying like, okay, if, would you not be shocked? That's kind of what makes it a purple state. What do you think about in this race and what's going on here? Would you guys be shocked if that were to happen?
Because it's an off year, I would not be shocked if it was a if it was a there was a national election. I don't think it would be possible. But because this race will be the number one thing turning people out, and there is enough numbers there to make it work, it is possible.
I actually agree. I would not be shocked based on what is happening in the national political environment, which is very kind of anti-Republican, anti-Trump right now. I think either of them could win. I think Talarico has a much better chance though.
Okay. And going with this kind of like anti-Trump mentality, Trump has not endorsed anyone on the Republican side of this race. Do you see that coming soon? If he does, what happens? Will it resolve it? Will it make it messier? I kind of know what I think, but I'm curious what you guys would say on that.
Pandemonium, I think. I think it would just cause a lot of problems, and I don't know that I'd want it right now. I think it just you have to build a coalition, and if you're trying to win 50 plus one, I'm not sure that that works. And even if you're not the Trump guy and then Trump endorses you, then what does that do to your base? Do they then are like, well, why am I voting for this guy if Trump? I don't know. It sounds very messy to me.
I feel like one way is messy, the other one ends the race. If he endorses Paxton, the primary's over. Paxton wins. I don't think it's close. If he endorses Wesley Hunt, and he could endorse
Yeah,
Hunt,
that's kind of true because he is winning already, and that would just solidify who he is.
Paxton's a candidate that has come in with a lot of baggage. We've seen these scandals, all these headlines with what's gone on with him. Do you think he's past that? Is that still going to be impacting his race moving forward, Michael?
It's funny, right? I think of it like I feel like none of us talk about House of Cards being like a political thriller anymore, and so I even think about scandals and issues and whatever, and I think a lot of people are desensitized to a lot of that. I don't think it really does as much as it used to. The things that might have ended someone's political career 20 years ago now can be overcome. So I
Yeah.
don't think it's that big of an issue.
Yeah.
it feels like Trump has shown that. I think Trump's kind of the one who like he got away with a lot of things that would have been a game changer and ended people's careers. And he kind of leaned in and didn't apologize, which I think to some extent Republicans have tried to use that as a, kind of the anti-Romney who apologized for saying something like binders full of women when he's just saying all he wants is women in his administration. He apologized for that. Meanwhile, Trump just says whatever he wants and doesn't apologize for anything. So it's interesting how that works. And obviously Trump has been more successful running national elections than Mitt Romney has.
That's true. All right. Do you guys have any final thoughts on the Texas race before we move on?
I got one. Just watch out for Wesley Hunt. I think he's the one who is the one who changes selection. I think if he gets over 20%, Cornyn is your candidate. I think if he gets under 20, it's going to be Paxton.
All right. Very interesting. Michael, anything before we go?
I just think that from the beginning of the runoff till the end of the runoff, a lot can happen. I mean, that's just a long time.
Very long time until November for sure. All right, next I want to go through Rasmussen recently put out a poll in the last couple weeks about economic fairness compared to economic growth and what people find as more important. So they put out a similar poll in March of 2024 when 55% of voters said that economic growth was more important than economic fairness. There was a 21-point margin. 34% of voters prioritized economic fairness. In this one, in the last couple weeks, it was a much tighter kind of neck and neck situation. 44% of adults said economic growth, while 42% said economic fairness. So we have a big jump up on people who prioritize economic fairness. Just kind of broad strokes response. Is this a response to recent events, things going on with the economy with Trump? What is your initial takeaway? Michael, do you want to start us off?
I think this is definitely people feeling the current economy, and it's not necessarily new either. I mean, you had the Biden administration having this same issue of, hey, the economy is doing great. Can't you see that? And I think you continue to have that issue now, where people, oh, look at what the stock market's doing. Look at all this stuff. We're growing. Look at the jobs report, whatever it is. But regular people don't feel that at all. They don't necessarily feel that inflation has ended. They don't feel that their wages are keeping up. So yeah, I think that that's the kind of stuff that changes a person's answer on a question like this.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I agree with Michael. I mean, the one point is, what does economic growth mean? I think over the past 5 or 6 years, maybe 8 years, I think people associate it more with Wall Street, like Michael said. When you talk about economic growth, that could be more small businesses. There's a lot to that, but it feels like that's almost directly like, oh, the stock market's doing well, but I'm not. It's the Main Street versus Wall Street. So I agree with Michael, and I will say that Trump's own language kind of has skewed more towards economic fairness too recently. I did not get a chance to see the crosstabs, but my guess is more Republicans. That's probably a lot of the movement is more Republicans. Is Trump's even talking like that? He said he wants fairness. He's using different terms to do that. So my guess is that, a lot of Republicans, for better or for worse, follow the president and what he says. So the more he's using terms like economic fairness, I think that kind of sinks in like, oh yeah, we want to fight the big guys. We don't care about the millionaires and corporations. We care about, my small business owner or the farmer. And I feel like that's kind of what Trump has talked about more in his second term.
Right.
And I think you see Republican politicians identifying different spaces, taxes, whatever it might be, where they see that it seems to be unfair, and that they can target an easy target, a big corporation or an industry or whatever it might be, and say, hey, we want to go after this in order to provide relief to the everyday person. And so they might counter their traditional we're friendly, we're big business friendly, and use that populist drive to go after bigger companies for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, I think you guys both kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of the terminology used here, because I think growth can mean different things to a lot of people, whether that's Wall Street, whether that's just the whole economy, people are doing better. I think fairness can mean a lot of different things. Is it, the populist sense of just the everyday people? Is it minorities? Is it, this group, that group? What does that mean? And how does that impact policy? Is going to be different across different demographics. So do you see this impacting policy broadly? Do you see kind of like the national economic policy changing at all in this climate, or do you think this is a result of that and you think people are leaning more into seeing economic fairness as an issue because all these things are kind of squeezing on their wallets?
Well, people are definitely reacting. There's definitely policy changes that are going on right now. I would say it's a blip, and that you'll see as soon as this populism streak ends at some point. I think you see that go away. But right now, if you're viewed as the establishment or a big business or whatever it might be, you can be an easy target for the masses.
Yeah, I think it goes with the Republicans kind of moving towards populism, which, that's basically the Trump that's was Trump's first thing. So I mean, they've moved away from, this corporate. And if you see rich people, you see people like they're voting more Democrat now than they ever have before. So it does feel like you see, union workers voting for Trump. Like it just is a different coalition. And I think that populism has made it so that Republicans who are saying, I used to be this way, but I love Trump, so I'm going to kind of echo what he's talking about. I think that has changed what the parties believe in to some extent.
Yeah, I agree. All right, last, I want to go through our recently released Overton Insights poll of Utah. We did a statewide poll of 1,000 registered voters in Utah just a few weeks ago. And I want to take you through some of the takeaways, some things that we found interesting, and some highlights on Utah polling. So, Michael, I really quick want to ask you, because you have a lot of experience in this department, how is polling Utah as a state different than other states? What are the things to look for here?
Well, I mean, the first things I think of are logistical, and just because this is what I've done and do, and Utah is a very young state, and so back in the day when we were doing a lot more live calling or robo dials or whatnot, it could be a lot harder to get people to respond. And so when texting and online surveys became a bigger thing, that really benefited polling in Utah, because it just skews so young. And that's a harder demographic to get. Um, Combined with the fact that it's a small state and a growing state. So figuring out where people live or where they moved to, and are they in the same district or where they've gone, there's a lot of shifts going on there that make it a little more difficult to keep track of where people are. Um, and then just a tidbit is, historically speaking, we could never call on Sunday or Monday nights, given the LDS population. And so it just meant that there was a different way of going out and polling them. But I'd also say that when it comes to polling in Utah, I think people make a lot of assumptions about Utahns, and so it's interesting to pull out what they actually think. Just for example, on this poll, we didn't ask questions like this, but I think it would be surprising to people that just within the last couple years, a majority of Utahns support the legalization of cannabis. That's an example of where people are at. And I think that would surprise people. I think people don't realize that there is a lot of Democrats and middle of the road people in the state, and it's not just one of those flyover, everybody's Republican. So that's what I'd say about Utah.
And one cool thing from the outside, I obviously don't know as much as Michael about Utah, but it was interesting seeing kind of, I think it's mostly LDS church members, if I'm not mistaken, that really don't love Trump's personality. And yeah, they voted for him at a plus 35, whatever, but like they got 20% for an independent kind of conservative candidate, 12 years ago because or not 12, 10 years ago, because he wasn't he wasn't a bad person. Like, oh, I really like this guy personally. He kind of believes in me. And kind of the moral side of me says that I can't necessarily vote for Donald Trump. So I think that's an interesting thing, that even the conservatives here are maybe don't love the way that Trump conducts himself. And you see all the elected officials in the state, and I think Mike would agree, are all pretty, nice, friendly people, don't have a lot of personal baggage. So it is interesting that it seems like morals might matter more in Utah than maybe any other state for politicians.
They definitely have an independent streak to them. The interesting thing there is critical thing is Trump was an outsider. Trump was not an incumbent. But everything you just said, Mark, is overridden pretty much the moment he became president. Because then it shifts to, oh, well, he's the president. We should support him. And that's a reflection in all of Utah, where generally incumbents are going to almost never lose. Incumbents do not have a lot of challenge. They're very much as a default of, well, what's the problem? Is that person doing something wrong? They must be doing all right. They're there, and so it's interesting that they have that independent streak, but then you don't see that necessarily pop up again once he's the incumbent in 2020 and 2024 as well.
Yeah, in this specific poll, we did poll the favorability of some of the statewide politicians plus Mitt Romney. So there were some interesting things there. Mark, do you want to kind of run through what those results were, what you think are the biggest takeaways?
Yeah, I know that I talked to Michael, obviously he lives in Utah, and he was pretty unsurprised by the results. John Curtis was the most popular politician, but also the least known. And again, if you're not necessarily, if you're not a fire thrower, if you're not, somebody who stirs up the media, they generally like you. Mike Lee, I mean, and somewhat of a surprising thing, was the least popular politician, but was super popular among conservatives. So it's like he's a little bit of a firebrand, and the middle and the left doesn't like that, but the Republicans like it the most, which is, honestly, in Utah, that's probably better. I'd rather have his +4 approval rating than John Curtis's +13 if it meant I'm going to win primaries and win general elections. So, I think that you can look through this and, being a little bit more unpopular among Democrats and independents isn't really a problem in Utah. I think I was a little surprised, and Michael, I don't think was, but a little surprised that Romney was still kind of in the plus with favorability. And people talk about how Republicans don't like him. He was -2 among Republicans. That's not bad. I mean, that's 50-50, where if you polled, the US, he's probably -30 among Republicans is my guess. So it's interesting to see that. And, Democrats, I wasn't surprised that Democrats liked him, but I would have thought Romney was 7 to 8 points underwater and he was 7 points above water. So I think that was the most surprising one to me.
Now, Mark, this is a great example of what I was trying to talk about when I was saying about purple states, because I think Utah is a great example of this. If you go back to Senator Lee's last election, you would have seen a coalition created between the Democrats and the independents and basically anybody that wasn't a Republican. And they're like, can we beat Mike Lee? And they didn't. But kind of going back to that Beto election in 2018, they got a lot closer, right? Like it was closer than people thought that it would be, and that's a reflection of the state of who's there and what they think. Romney is fascinating, right? Because Democrats and independents who might not really be Mormon, Romney is their favorite Mormon, right? He's their favorite Republican, and they love him, and so that means that the conservatives in the Republican Party hate him just as much as they love Mike Lee.
It's funny though, because Romney was a racist and a sexist when he ran for president, but now that he's not running for president, people the left really likes him. That's an interesting kind of flip there.
Well, I think you have to remember it also depends on what you mean by the left. The left in Utah likes him. I don't know that the left in New York or California would be Mitt Romney fans.
That's fair.
That is fair. All right. We also polled a lot of different policy issues in this survey. We talked about housing, we talked about surveillance, occupational licensing, education, lots of different interesting things. Michael, what were your biggest takeaways on the policy side of what we polled?
Well, I found it interesting that people were very supportive of a number of housing reforms that we posed to them, talking about accessory dwelling units. These are your mother-in-law apartments or little extra cottage in your backyard. People were very supportive of being able to build those. People were very supportive of being able to split your lot. And this is an idea behind infill and being able to reduce sprawl is take a lot and build more houses on it than the one that's currently on it. It can be very controversial. It is a very controversial thing, but people seem to say, hey, why not? But then on the flip side, when we talk about housing affordability and all that kind of stuff, they blame the developers and inflation and all those things for high housing costs, and they don't really realize why those things really are. They don't realize that, at the end of the day, demographics is the number one thing to blame. The millennial population is so much bigger than Gen X. But then on top of that, because of the limitations in growth in Utah, land prices are very high. It's hard to develop, and that comes because it's very difficult to go through the process with cities and local governments to even get approved, and the timing and all the things that happen. And they highlighted, they said they support two policies that are not allowed in a majority of the state, right? And so that's one of the interesting things I found about what people were saying here in Utah.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Mark, what did you think about our policy results?
Yeah, Michael kind of took mine. I thought it was really interesting about the YIMBY NIMBY things. I mean, as somebody who lives in Tennessee, I've seen a lot of polling across the country, have not seen much in Utah before. But when we asked about accessory dwelling units in somebody's neighborhood, we asked about micro schools in people's neighborhood, assuming that all health and safety was followed. Those were huge numbers of support. I think it was 85% for ADUs, 70% almost for micro schools in their neighborhood. And I think that's a really interesting number because a lot of times you hear people say, oh, we want more of this or this, but like, oh no, not in my neighborhood. I want it somewhere else. But people were actually saying in Utah, I'm willing to put those in my neighborhood so long as the basic rules are followed. So I think that's really interesting compared to other states where that is not the case. So it feels like, at least looking from the outside of the polling, that Utah is way more open to, less government, or they want less government intervention in terms of, housing and property rights. Which I mean, I think is really encouraging for me, kind of seeing what happens in other states. So that was really surprising to me because there's always this difference. I mean, you see somewhere like, they call them the limousine liberals who say, oh, I want more housing, I want all this stuff. But like you see them in San Francisco, I don't want them in my neighborhood. They can go, 500 miles away and I'm okay with that. But Utahns are saying, I believe in this and I'm cool with it in my neighborhood. So I think that was a really interesting result.
I think one of the things you're seeing, Mark, and again, this kind of goes back to Texas, right? Where I would argue a lot of people don't participate, they don't vote. And I think it's the same thing here in Utah, because if you're up at the legislature or if you were in the inbox of a local official or a state official, you would not agree with what you just said.
Mhm.
Because at the end of the day, the people who are against things are much more active and vocal. And so people hear from the NIMBYs all the time, but they don't hear from the YIMBYs, right? And so I'd say it's how it goes for a number of policies that we polled. Yeah, the average Utahn is supportive of them, but also the average Utahn would not actually engage or say anything or be activated. Instead, the people that would be against those policies are very well organized. They're very much making their voice heard. Because you could go down the line for a number of issues. We talked about housing. We talked about microschools, daycares. We talked about truth and surveillance. The idea that whenever a law enforcement, a local entity is going to use a new technology, that there needs to be a public hearing about it, and that people need to know what's going on, and it needs to be approved by a legislative body. That was another thing that we asked about. And people overwhelmingly were like, yeah, that's a great idea. But guess what? Those kinds of ideas are very, very difficult to pass up at the Utah legislature, because the average person is not going to say, hey, will you protect my privacy? They're not going to do that. College degrees. People were saying, hey, why do we have to have degrees for so many of these occupational licenses? That doesn't make any sense. But guess what? The higher ed institutions are running up all over up there, and they're going to say, no, that's not a good idea. And the regular people aren't going to be there to say, no, we do want this. So that's the divide, I think, and that's everywhere. The divide in politics is, it's really about who shows up.
And let me add one thing to that, because I think everything you said is 100% right, but it's also, where do you value these? Like, if you have to order how important these priorities to
Yeah,
you,
yeah.
NIMBYs, it might be 20th on their list. NIMBYs, it's number one, right? So like, you have these people, even though they believe in it, it's lower than immigration, it's lower than, so they're not, if they are being activated, it's not for that issue, it's for other issues. So I think the importance matters too.
Well, and that's interesting, right? Because, for example, if we talked about our privacy issues, but instead framed it around a murder investigation, I think you might see the numbers flip. You know, people might be, oh, it's a murder. Well, then I'm okay with that. You know, people are not necessarily ideologically consistent, and so if you give them different scenarios, it very much could change and shift depending on what it is. And so that's another issue at play.
Yeah, I agree. Um, okay, and then Mark, you showed up in the right attire today. Probably the biggest Utah Jazz fan I've ever met. Uh, we did ask some interesting questions about the Utah Jazz, about some of the sports scene in Utah. Would you kind of tell us a little bit about what's going on there, what you found surprising?
Well, I will say one thing. I didn't say this on any of my TV interviews, but I could talk frankly here. I don't know what's wrong with the people in Utah who think the Jazz are on the right direction. I think it's crazy. Now, I actually feel like they're in the right direction now because of a big trade that happened last week, but the poll was out in the field beforehand. So, it's funny, there's a big investigation into kind of tanking in the NBA where you're intentionally losing games to get a higher draft pick, and the Jazz are kind of front and center on that discussion. But it's interesting that most people who follow the Jazz were happy with the direction they were going, which includes, 4 straight losing seasons, not even close to the playoffs, and intentionally losing games. So maybe that's just, and I don't, maybe it's the competitor in me, but I hate that.
Mark, you made an interesting remark there. You said people that follow the Jazz. And is that a crosstab we have? Did
Yeah,
Oh,
it
so
is.
it is people that okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, well, in a broad broad sense, like I feel like half people wouldn't even know what the Jazz are up to. Okay, so is even
Actually,
among those
33% of them don't know what the Jazz are up to. So that's
Yep.
who said they don't
Okay,
follow the Jazz. So about
33%.
65%.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So that was just interesting. I don't understand it, but I think that Jazz have made great moves. But yeah, the sports thing in Utah with the Olympics, we see the Winter Olympics now. People hate the logo. Michael gave a reason for it, which I was not aware of, but it's a terrible looking logo. But Michael, explain that. So tell me about what you said the logo, the reason for it.
No, I think it was in the media and things, and my understanding is that one of the big pushes with the logo was to make it visible to those who have difficulty with their eyesight. And so using big block text rather than, cursive or small lines makes it easier for those who are, the eyesight impaired to actually be able to see the logo. And so there was a big push to invest and advertise the Paralympics as well. And so I think that's where a lot of that, just that particular principle in the logo, that's my understanding where it came from.
But I think what Michael said earlier is actually like I feel like the people in Utah are just very positive. I don't know if you agree, but like pretty much everything you ask them about, they're the Mammoth, the Jazz, they're just pretty much optimistic about things, and it just seems like they're happier, just more optimistic people. So even if like, oh, I'm not sure about this, like, oh, we'll just say it's going well. It just feels like that is different than when you talk about like the Northeast, like New York, Pennsylvania, where everyone seems pessimistic about everything. The people in Utah are just generally happy, and there's like, oh, there's not a huge problem. Things are going well then.
We have a term for that, Mark. It's called "all is well in Zion." That is the term for it. And sometimes, even for our organization, that's where it's tough for us, where we feel like people feel like, it's fine, things are fine. Is there really a problem here? And it's like, no, there is for certain people. You got But anyway, all is well. All is well.
Yep, yep, yeah, and we saw a lot of people saying that the direction of the state was going in the right direction too. It was +1 though, so kind of interesting. There were a lot of people undecided on that, so it's kind of interesting to add in that discussion. All right, any final thoughts on our poll that you guys wanted to go through today? All right, do you guys have any political hot takes for me?
I have one, and I think Michael's gonna probably put me in my place in this one, but here's my I've looked at the Texas thing, so I had 2 predictions on that are I think that John Cornyn wins the Republican primary in an upset. I think James Talarico wins by double digits on the Democratic side. I don't think it's even close. I say Talarico +12. I say Cornyn +3. I think obviously he wants to avoid a runoff if possible. That's probably not likely, but I think that he has been there. He has won elections. I know it's not exactly like Susan Collins, but there is a value to somebody who consistently wins elections on the federal level. And, it doesn't always work out, but I'm betting him at 21 cents on the dollar to say I think he can win the election. So those are my two kind of out there predictions.
Hmm. I find that interesting, Mark. I would say if all things remain consistent, I think you'll be wrong, right? If there continues to be things that happen with ice in different places, if the temperature stays heated up, then I feel like the opposite of what you said would happen. I think what you're saying is a likely scenario. If things come back to where they normally go, right? Come back to the middle and just that general principle. So yeah, it could happen, but I think it just depends on, do people stay heated up and upset about what's going on, or does it go away? And the funny thing about this particular thing is, again, March could look one way, May could look another, November could look another. So that's what's interesting for me, and so it might be interesting that if what you're saying is wrong in March, but it doesn't matter because we go to a runoff and it works out in what so that's the interesting thing. And I only bring that kind of stuff up for people because I just want, because this podcast is about polling, right? And I just want to bring back for people to remember a poll is a snapshot. It's a snapshot, right? And so even the election is a snapshot. Things are snapshots of a certain period in time, and then things move and shift before and after. And so that's the only reason I comment on that, to help people understand how all of this even works.
And also, I agree with Michael 100%, even though I have my prediction, because my prediction is that when Talarico wins in the primary and they go to a runoff and they see the head-to-head polling of Paxton versus him, and, Paxton's down by 3 and Cornyn's up by 3, that they care more about electability than somebody who agrees with him. So I agree fully with what he's saying, but I think Republicans don't want to lose Texas, and I think they're going to see Cornyn's clearly the better candidate in the head-to-head race as based on polling right now. And if that continues, they're going to say, we can't let this guy win. We need to figure this out and elect Cornyn.
Yeah.
That's very possible. Yeah. People come up with interesting ways to justify their decisions, and electability, I think, will turn out to be a big thing. I think in a runoff that I didn't mention this. I think that's what the runoff's going to be about. The runoff's very much going to be about, hey, we think this guy's going to win on the other side, so we need to put in this guy to be. That's going to be a lot of what is happening in that runoff.
And it's likely we'll have a Democratic nominee without a runoff, right? So that's what's, I think they're with only 2 people. So the Republicans will know where they're going.
Perhaps you got to get 50.
Yeah. Electability is shaping up to be a big part of this race, and we will definitely keep our eye on what's going on in Texas. That is it for this week's edition of The Polling Alley. Thanks for joining us as we analyzed the data and uncovered the insights shaping today's political landscape. If you enjoyed the conversation, make sure to follow and subscribe. You can find more insights and analysis from our team at Overton Insights by following us on X at Overton Insights and visiting overtoninsights.com. We'll be back soon. Thanks so much for listening.